Welcome to the Institutions and Structures Breakout session. This pillar is guided by the question, what if our laws were anti-racist? What if our laws were anti-racist? At IF, our Institutions and Structures pillar focuses on disrupting systems in government and philanthropy that perpetuate anti-Black racism and other intersectional discriminatory harms. My name is Timmy Bennett. I'm an attorney. I'm from Chicago, but I claim DC as I've lived here since 2005. In my role as Director of Policy at IF, I engage local governments in the DC metropolitan region in approaches to developing and implementing racially equitable and just policies that enable BIPOC communities to thrive. Although this pillar focuses on both government and philanthropic transformation, today our discussion will focus on IF's DC government work. Government institutions created a racially structured society that caused racial inequity by advantaging white people and disadvantaging Black people and people of the global majority. Beginning with 246 years of chattel slavery, followed by congressional mismanagement of the Freedmen's Savings Bank, which left 61,144 depositors with losses of nearly $3 million in 1874, violent government-backed massacres like the dissemination of Tulsa's Greenwood District in 1921, and discriminatory policies throughout the 20th century, including the Jim Crow era's Black codes, strictly limiting opportunity in many Southern states, the GI Bill, the New Deal's Fair Labor Standards Act, exemption of domestic and agricultural and service occupations, and redlining, and related contract buying. The American government extracted and prevented the accumulation of wealth and offered security, choice, and economic mobility that wealth enables in a capitalist society. These federal discriminatory practices were also mirrored at the local level. If you study the district's history, you will learn that the mayor and the board of aldermen, the precursor to the Council of the District of Columbia, legislated the first set of Black codes that sought to solidify slavery as an institution and strengthened racial segregation in the city. This history directly contributes to the racial segregation that we see today. Washington, DC remains one of the most segregated cities in the United States. More than 70% of its Black or white residents would have to move in order for the two groups to be equally distributed. The racial residential segregation created distinct pathways to opportunity or lack thereof. It determined the quality of schools children attended, the types of employment opportunities, the presence of stable, decent housing, and the availability of healthy food and amenities like green space. In 2011, the district's African-American population slipped below 50% for the first time in more than 50 years. In addition to the current decline in the Black population, the district's disparities in wealth, employment, and home ownership rates, and educational and health outcomes continue to grow. White households have a net worth 81 times greater than Black households, 284,000 versus 3,500. Even 50 years after significant civil rights gains, the impact of race continues to shape the outcomes of all institutions. IF continues to build relationships and support coalitions to transform how government resources are deployed, an ultimate goal of disrupting and dismantling the public and private structures that perpetuate these systems of extraction, greed, and harm. I've invited our government partners, Dr. Brian McClure, Director of DC Council's Office of Racial Equity, Dr. Amber Hewitt, DC's Chief Equity Officer, and our coalition partner, Dushaw Hockett, founder of an executive director of Safe Places for the Advancement of Community and Equity, also known as SPACES, and he's the co-facilitator of the DC Initiative on Racial Equity in Local Government. Let me pin our guests just so everybody will be able to see them. And welcome, Brian. Let me find, here's Dushaw. And Amber, great. Hey guys. So IF currently supports two coalitions, the DC Initiative on Racial Equity in Local Government, also known as the DC Initiative, in the Montgomery County Racial Equity Network, also known as the MORE Network. We are also funding the incubation of a coalition in Fairfax County called the Black Voices of Fairfax. Dushaw, I'm gonna start with you. Who is the DC Initiative on Racial Equity in Local Government, and how has IF supported and furthered the goals of the DC Initiative?
Thanks, Timmy, and hey, good people, happy Tuesday to you. So Timmy, before I answer that question, let me answer it through a very quick story, because I think it sums up why we are doing what we're doing. And some of you may know this. I think one of the most consequential longitudinal studies of our time was a research project that Johns Hopkins did some years ago. And what they did was they followed a group of 800 young people, mostly Black and brown young people, from first grade up through young adulthood. And they wanted to see how they fared over the 20 plus years. And long story short, and this comes as no surprise, what Johns Hopkins documented was that the majority of those 800 young people remained in the same social and economic situation that they were born into, despite everything that government, nonprofit organizations threw their way over 20 plus years. So the bottom line, all this service work, all this advocacy work, all these government programs didn't move the needle. And part of what Hopkins argued is that if we don't do something radically different, every jurisdiction will experience the same thing. And so I want to say, Timmy, that in many ways, the DC Initiative on Racial Equity is an attempt to do something radically different in terms of how we address racial equity. And bottom line is, we are a collective of service groups, advocacy groups, community organizing groups. We have a coordinating committee made up of a handful of organizations that many of you know: Empower DC, One DC, Bread for the City, Caresen, JUFJ, and Spaces. And in many ways, before IF became IF, I'll throw a little Prince in this and say, you know, the organization formerly known as the Consumer Health Foundation, but you know, before IF became IF, you know, IF was a big part of this work, and I would say IF has supported this work in three ways. So number one was seeding. And so it was IF that brought all of the organizations together in 2015 as part of a symposium to have a conversation about what would it look like to bring different strands of the DC organizing and sector together with government to try to make some stuff happen. So one would be this sort of idea of seeding. Two would be sustaining. When the service groups, advocacy groups, organizing groups said, you know what, we don't want to stop at a symposium, we want to keep this going. It was IF that committed funds to ensure that we had some facilitation support over a period of years to keep it going. And then I would say the last thing would be strategizing. And so, you know, Timmy continuing to serve as a thought partner and dropping all that knowledge that she just dropped a little while ago. And so let me just stop there. That's who we are.
Thanks, Dushaw. And so let's flip to, and I'll say that Dushaw operated, like, he was DC Initiative's first facilitator. So for years, Dushaw was the only one bringing us together as a coalition. And if you know, it's so hard to do coalitions because you're operating with different personalities, different organizations, different institutional values. And so hats off to you, Dushaw, for always supporting the coalition from the jump.
Yeah.
You know, I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Um, I'll say in 2021, if we launch our Government Leaders in Action Table. So the Government Leaders in Action Table supports regional professionals who are operationalizing racial equity in local government. I'm distinguishing this from people and government workers that care about this work from people that are actually paid to operationalize racial equity in government. This is their job, this is their role. And we provided capacity building for them. We provided policy healing and a consultant self-care. So what we were hearing, we convened the CEOs in 2019 when we can actually still meet in person. And we said, what do you need? And people were talking about self-care and healing justice in a way that we had not heard before. So we had heard around FTE support, how folks like, you know, a lot of jurisdiction were hiring CEOs, chief equity officers, and thinking, okay, we did it. We don't need to do anything else. While not providing any support for these CEOs and just assuming did it check the box. We did racial equity in this jurisdiction. And then in addition to like the lack of FTE support that folks felt like they had, it was the question of self-care. How do you sustain us in these roles? How do you make sure that the work doesn't leave when I'm burnt out and I check out and I move on to something else? And so both Brian and Amber are participants in our 2021 cohort. And so my question for you two is, how has IF supported you in your roles? And Brian, we've known each other for years. Like our work predates the cohort and predates your role. And like, you know, you could even talk about like your work. I'd love for you to talk about how the coalition helped you support and further your role. If you don't know, Brian McClure is the author of the REACH Act in DC. This is the racial equity legislation. He used to work for McDuffie, and then he authored the REACH Act. And I feel like the coalition was so integral in like helping, aiding, and pushing when folks weren't trying to do the work. And, you know, I felt the coalition was really powerful, impactful, and that's like what the power of coalition is. So I love for you to talk about the power of coalition. But then also, Amber, we were so excited for Dr. Hewitt to come on as the CEO, the Chief Equity Officer for DC, and she's hit the ground running. Amber, I'd love for you to talk about anything exciting that's going on with you and how IF has been able to support you in your role.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I know we're running kind of short on time, but thank you for the invitation. There's so many familiar faces that I see in this virtual space. You know, I'll just jump right in and I'll do my best to try to touch on some of the questions that you raised. You know, one of the things that you all have continued to talk about, and I heard it mentioned before the breakout sessions, you know, is what is the space that we want to envision? What is the society that we want to live in? And so in one of the initial Government Leaders in Actions convenings, you all asked us that question. I don't know if you remember that, to me. You had us sit down and think about what is the society we're trying to envision. I had never done that before. You know, in government, we are so immersed in the work and trying to move the work forward that we don't have that space to just sit back and to dream and to dream outside the box. And so that was one of the first times that I was actually encouraged to be creative. And so that was transformative. And so it also is symbolic or emblematic of sort of the relationship that I've had with IF and the Consumer Health Foundation and even the DC initiative, is you all have pushed government to think outside the box and to not take excuses of why we can't do things or why we do things the old way, but like, what if there's this great society that we can actually have? Well, we can. You know, Timmy, you started by talking about one of the examples you gave of how we ended up with all these racial inequities is because of like the failures of the Freedmen Savings Bank in 1876. Well, like that was one of the brief moments in history where government was creating a new society and it was working briefly. Like I have a letter, and I'll be brief. I have a letter where my family received allocation of funds from the Freedmen's Bank. And they were like, this is to create generational wealth. I wish I would have brought the letter. I'll share that with you, Timmy. But it's fascinating. It says, so your children and their grandchildren will have access to the American dream. I never seen anything like that before. And then by 1877, they removed the troops from the South, and it all just goes downhill from there. And so one of the things that we do, we begin to look at, you asked the question, what if laws were anti-racist? Well, they're not. And they are continuing, this isn't just something that's happened years ago or decades ago, right? It's still happening. So our office is here to examine these bills in order to determine their impact and to have the space to think outside the box, to get input from you all. Like right now, we're actually revamping our conclusions rubric. And IF has been an amazing thought partner and help us to think about the big picture. And I'll end by saying, also helping us to think of ways to capture the voice from the community. And I think it was Tony from the prior session who made the point that like, hey, like we belong here. And so for us to just to have this concept of like, we can engage the community and there's a way to go about it. And then for you all to provide the resources and the roadmap to do it has been instrumental. So I'll try to stop there. Apologies if I was too long-winded.
You're fine. Amber, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. And Timmy, thank you for having me in the IF Foundation. And it's just interesting how life works. I actually knew both Brian and Deshaw before coming into this role. So I know this question was about how IF has supported and partnered with me, but I just want to thank Deshaw and the DC Initiative. The Mayor's Office of Racial Equity meets with the DC Initiative almost monthly, and that's been an invaluable resource to have a direct connection to thought leaders and the advocates who push for the passage of the REACH Act. So I want to thank Deshaw and also thank Brian, who's like a brother to me and who's been invaluable from sort of beginning until now, and excited about the work that we'll do.
I'll just say, Amber, he vouched for you. Brian called us and said, no, she's a good sister. Like, she's good. Like, she cares. Like, he did. He reached out and said, oh, I don't know if y'all know. I know her, and she's good. And that vouch, that Black people vouch, especially, that's important.
So I appreciate that. And I would say the first memory that comes to mind when I think about the question about how IF has supported me is that FTE support. Luckily, there are 5 FTEs that were already budgeted to be on the team. Right now, we've staffed up to 4. And I know that is not always common across other jurisdictions. However, when I first started, I take this work seriously. This is hard work for me. HERT work for me. I feel the weight of the role very heavily. And I was very, frankly, overwhelmed by the scope of the role. And I remember Marlisa Gamblin, who's one of the consultants that partners with IF, met with me, and I was just so overwhelmed in a great way about the support that she provided. So that has just been instrumental and helped us hit the ground running. Like Timmy said, we've already produced multiple racial equity tools. We're working with 12 agencies across district government, including the police department, fire, energy and environment, education, parks and recreation, to develop department-specific action plans. So if it wasn't for that support, I don't think we would be as far along as we are now. I would also say it's been supportive also. I think I mentioned just the support network, and I haven't been closely tied to healing justice work. I think before I got connected with Timmy, and I don't think I could have defined it as beautifully. I forgot the woman's name who defined it earlier, and that's just been instrumental for me to continue to check my own internalization of an endorsement of white supremacy culture. And also it's helped, to provide an accountability structure. I know that we have the government leaders and action table. In addition to a support, it's a place for constant learning, sharing best practices, and holding ourselves accountable. And I would say the biggest way it's impacted me is being able to lean on an organization that is so committed to and understands how systems work. So I'm a counseling psychologist by training, and I study sort of family systems and systems dynamics, and we know how systems are designed to maintain the status quo and their resistance to change. And I feel that every day. I feel that in every meeting that I am a part of. So understanding that and leaning on an organization that has those resources and supports has been truly invaluable. So thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to say before, because we only have a few minutes left, and I thought we'd have more time. They ate into our time, and it looks like they're not trying to give us more time. So, but because I did want to open it up to questions, but I did want to say the reason why I selected these IF partners was because they represent our inside-outside strategy. So DuShaw and the coalition, like this was our outside game, right? Like we have been advocating, we funded racial equity trainings before we could even get to the racial equity legislation. DC Initiative has been so instrumental in doing the trainings with council members and just to say like, this is the legislation that we need. And then Amber, the fact that you have 5 FTEs, other jurisdictions weren't doing that. We worked with Brian and said she needs more than one person, right? And so like, not only does she need more than one person, we said that there should be a council office on racial equity, not just within the executive. And so many jurisdictions focus on the executive, but we really wanted the council, like our legislative branch, to have an office on racial equity and the executive. And so DuShaw represents our outside strategy, and both you and Brian represent our inside strategy. You are advocates within government, and DuShaw and the coalitions are advocates with outside of government, and we play on each other to advance the work. And so like, if like we have government partners, we have coalition partners, we have advocates, we're playing the whole field because we want everybody to be involved, but we also want to exert pressure when the pressure needs to be exerted.
And Timmy, just real quick, because I know we're almost out of time, like the racial equity impact assessments was not in the initial legislation. And you and DuShaw was like, what are y'all doing? Like, that's the whole point. And I was like, why would we do that? Like, no one else is doing it. Like, I don't even know what this is.
Right.
And I was like, all right, we'll work and we'll try to figure it out. And we definitely went back, and you know, now that's one of, I think, the most successful things that have come out of it. And both my office is doing it, and is Amber has mentioned her office is doing some of that as well.
Yeah. That on top of, I'll say, because this is like one of my like favorite moments of the coalition, and it shows the power of a coalition. But like, and we're not gonna say any names, but there was a council member with a lot of power that was trying to change the REACH Act in the 9th hour, was trying to take literally taking the entire section, a third part of the section of the legislation out. And Brian got word to the coalition started tweeting, and that legislation was put right back in, and the bill moved forward intact. This is the power of coalition, the power of the people, in a way that, you know, is transformative and can be transformative. We got 2 seconds. Go ahead, DuShaw, what are you gonna say?
No, I just want to lift up a point that you raised a short while ago about the paradigm shift. Traditionally, the paradigm has been that government is either a target or government is a partner or collaborator. You know, part of our argument is government can be both. And as you said, sometimes government is a collaborator, sometimes government is a target, but it's not an either or.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I think we're gonna get kicked out, but send your chat. If you have questions, send them in the chat and we'll still answer them. We have an after party. So if I'll ask DuShaw, Amber, Brian, can you answer some questions in the chat for a second? All right, perfect. Send your questions and we'll get you. See y'all soon.